My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington. I'd like to welcome all of you to this briefing event focusing on the role of the media in the GCC crisis and all the excitement that have been taking place over the past 6-7 weeks, from hacking to targeting media outlets to limiting freedom of the press and what have you. And we have, with all the confusion that we have been exposed to the last few weeks, we have a panel of 3 keen observers and interested parties, directly in some interested in the events that are taking place, to help us understand, decipher, if you will, all the information that has been made public during the past few weeks with all kinds of contradictions. Of course, as you well know, events started unfolding back in May with news of the closure of certain media outlets in the region by countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. And then the campaign, if you will, raising some demands at Qatar from initially these 3 countries. They were joined by an additional 4 or 5 countries after that. And then they kind of hesitated to put anything in writing in terms of the demands. But eventually, a list of 13 demands were issued to the mediating parties. And as you will know, since the beginning of this conflict, the number of mediators began to exceed the number of claimants in this conflict. But at any rate, eventually the main mediating party, the state of Kuwait, did receive a list of 13 demands from Saudi Arabia on behalf of the groups complaining or boycotting Qatar. And of course, of key importance, you all are aware of the contents of the demands, but of key importance to us this morning are 2 demands that basically Qatar must shut down Al Jazeera and all affiliated channels affiliated with Al Jazeera. In addition, there was another request that basically all media outlets backed by Qatar or Qatari sources, directly or indirectly, and that includes, for those of you who are familiar with Arabi 21, Rasd, the New Arab TV and website, Middle East Eye, Kamlin, Sharq, etc., etc., etc. So it's been a kind of a busy period of concern to not just people in the media, with particularly these affected outlets, but with all people concerned with freedom of the press and freedom of expression in the region. Because in addition to these demands, of course, some of these countries already announced some severe threats against activists or people on the internet, tweeting or whatever on Facebook and what have you, that might take sides in this conflict. Actually, the sympathizing with Qatar in this conflict was viewed as an unfriendly, if not illegal, activity by some countries. And you know that some countries have even announced that there will be prison terms associated with that if you're caught doing that. And actually, several activists have been taken into custody the last couple of weeks in Bahrain, in the Emirates, with threats of 10 to 15 years of jail, which is kind of, on the one hand, exaggerated. On the other hand, is very worrisome. It seems to me, again, that some of these countries do not seem to heed the lessons of history, which is if you do not like the message, you might be able to shoot the messenger. But frankly, at this day and age, with the type of media we have today, the message is going to persist, and the message is going to continue to spread, like it or not. And they seem to kind of ignore that thinking that in the 21st century somehow just because you do not like the message, you have the right to shoot the messenger. So to help us kind of piece all this stuff together, we have three panelists. We're going to start basically with my colleague, Tamara Kharroub, who has her PhD is in media studies, modern media, and its role in politics. She's the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Analyst at the Arab Center, and she will kind of give us a background, kind of fit, if you will, what's happening in the Gulf in its historical context, because as you will know, these events or the clash that's taking place, what is known now as the GCC crisis, is not new. Some of us who are have been observing or studying the region for a long time, we know that similar issues emerged in 95 and 96, in 2012, 2013, 2014. So we're kind of used to this recurrent, if you will, clash over almost the same issues, you know, again and again. So in addition to Tamara, we also have, and very honored and pleased to have Courtney Ratch with us today. Courtney is well known to the human rights community, those of you who come from that background, and particularly the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is at the forefront of exposing what's happening today and opposing some of these measures. And she is also known to people who are Middle East oriented or specialized in the audience because also of her expertise in the region and applying her advocacy as Director of Advocacy at the Committee to Protect Journalists to the Middle East. And last but not least, we'll have Abdulrahman Ashayal. Abdu, a good friend, we're delighted to have him here. Abdu flew from London all the way to be with you today. That's where he lives and he works at Al-Arabi Al-Jadid and involved both in this new outfit, basically website, and some of you are aware of the great news that gets published by the website, but also involved with the whole family of Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, which, by the way, as a TV network will be launched next week. So it's getting very close for the official launch. So we're also delighted to have him here. Each speaker will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes, and we'll have Q&A. The cards and the pencils on the chairs are not there to prevent you from sitting down comfortably. They are there for you to ask questions. So when we get to the Q&A session, please just identify yourself, your name, and the question to whom you would like to direct your question, if to anybody specific or to the whole panel. And we'd be delighted to collect these when the Q&A session starts. Just raise your hand with your card, and staff will pick up the questions, and then we'll engage in the art of conversation for the balance of our time. So again, thank you for being here, and I would like at this time to invite my colleague, Dr. Tamara Kharroub, to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Khalil. Good morning, everyone. Today I would like to focus on three main points regarding the role of media in the GCC crisis. Can you hear me? I'll get closer. As I said, I would like to focus on three main points. The first point has to do with cyber wars and technology, and I'm not talking about the video game, for those of you who play games. The second point is about the public sphere and democratization, and my third point will be briefly about human rights and international law. It is often said that wars are fought on two fronts, on the ground and in the media. And this is no less true than with the GCC crisis. We have seen the media being used as a tool of warfare, for hacking, to suppress freedoms of expression online, and we've seen demands to shut down media organizations. And as we all know, for decades, the media has been used as a powerful tool for political ends and in conflicts. I would like to start by discussing the advancements of technology and their implications for this role of media in politics. Allow me to start with a couple of examples from history. If we go back to World War I, we've seen here in the US a series of posters, the war propaganda campaigns that were publicized all over the country, encouraging Americans to support the war and to enlist, from America needs you to America wants you and America wake up. These posters have played a significant role in selling the war to the American people. And then it was a simple technology. It was basic print media. It played an important role in cultivating the support. If we fast forward a few decades, 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson is running for president, and his campaign airs an ad that became known as Daisy. For those of you who don't know Daisy, I encourage you to go and watch the ad. It's a 1-minute ad that changed the direction of the presidential elections at the time. It was the technology was audiovisual capabilities. We had broadcast TV, and that enabled the use of the technology to portray emotions, dramatic effects, and to basically reach the people. And the purpose of the campaign was to trigger fear among Americans of the other candidate as a potential starter of a nuclear war. And although this ad was controversial, it was taken off the air. It ran only once, but it is believed to have contributed significantly to the landslide victory of LBJ in the elections. Now, fast forward 2017, technology has developed rapidly and drastically, and now we have the potential for cyber wars. And this is what we're starting to see here. If we look at the GCC crisis, first, just on a simple level, we've seen the blockading countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, who were using the social media to target individual citizens online and arrest them for expressing sympathy with Qatar. On a more serious level, we've seen the hacking. Only a few days ago, it was reported that the United Arab Emirates government was behind the hack of the Qatar News Agency. It was reported that US intelligence agencies believed that the Emirati government was behind the hack. And the hack basically attributed false statements to the Emir of Qatar, statements in favor of Iran, Hamas, and Israel, all at once, if that's even possible. And the timing of this hack was very significant. It only came 2 days after President Trump's visit to the region and his statements focusing on countering Iran and countering violent extremism. And the content of the false statements attributed to the Emir of Qatar are an indication that this was a deliberate action to portray Qatar as a threat to the United States. The deliberate part of this is important because it can be considered as an act of war. It was said for several years, the last few years, that 2017 will be the year of cyber warfare. And this is what we're beginning to see here. It's the deliberate attack against a state using computer technology for political ends, strategic political ends. We will be seeing more of those cyber attacks and cyber wars. And I think cyber attacks will be the beginning of conflicts and wars in the futures, and we have to take them very seriously. My second point has to do with the other side of the coin. Yes, the media can be used as a tool of warfare, can be used as a tool to suppress freedoms, and in a way legitimize conflicts like the Saudi-led quartet did, but it's also an important component of democracy. Participatory democracy is built on the premise of informed citizens and the public sphere, which is the platform of the free flow of information, informed debate, and discussion that is essential for the public to be informed and to be enabled to participate in the political process. Now in the digital era, this is most prominently enabled through the media. And the media plays a very important role in facilitating and advocating for this free forum for debate and discussion. If we look at the Arab world today, it was not always, it did not always have a diversity of media sources. Only a little over 2 decades ago, the media was the official mouthpiece of governments in their respective countries. And with in the 1990s, with the onset of satellite technology, it was possible for private commercial entities, independent individuals, to set up media organizations. And that was significant because it was the beginning of a forum of free expression. In this context, the media was able to transcend government control, to hold media institutions and to hold government institutions accountable, and to enable the people to be informed and participate in the political process. And that was an information revolution in the Arab world. Now, unfortunately, we see demands to shut down media organizations. And that's certainly an attempt to close these public forums of free discussion of issues that are of public concern. I would like to say that we know the media is considered the fourth estate. The job of the media is to be a watchdog on governments, not to praise officials, if I may add. And it's a very important responsibility for the media to inform the public, to scrutinize government, and to enable this free and independent political discussion. So the freedom of the press is a right, but also the right to information is a right. And not only for individuals, but also for as an important catalyst, as a prerequisite for democratization and the promotion of a democratic culture in the Arab world. My third point, my last point, briefly, has to do with the international law. The demands to shut down media organizations from Al Jazeera to Al Arabi Jadid and a long list of other media organizations that are believed to be associated with Qatar. Not only violate the right to information and the freedom of the press, but also international law and human rights. UN Security Council, General Assembly, and other resolutions have confirmed that people have the right to free access to information, but also states have the right to create and establish media institutions. The UN Human Rights Council considers closing media organizations as an attack on journalists and calls on states to facilitate and provide a free environment for journalists to work. And needless to say, demands to shut down those media organizations are in violation of international law and human rights. Just as a final note, whether we agree or not with the approach or agendas of certain media organizations, that's not the point. Like Khalil said, we might not like the message, but we shouldn't shoot the messenger. I think if there is a legitimate concern about negative effects of certain aspects of reporting, and we have not established that specifically with the GCC crisis, but if there were legitimate, valid concerns in any context, then the solution is not to suppress the freedom of the press and people's rights to information. There are certain measures that can be taken and have been taken in different parts of the world, including facilitating evidence-based reporting, fact-checking, verifying sources, and so on. And this is not a concern only for mainstream traditional forms of media like television, but also more so actually online. The internet provides a platform for alternative, independent voices to express their views. And that can be a very good thing, but it can also be a negative thing, as we have seen in the past. And in this context, I would like to suggest facilitating and introducing programs of media literacy to enable and to provide people with the skills to be able to assess sources and discern sources of information and be better prepared to consume different sources of media, different points of view. Just finally, to reiterate, I would like to emphasize the importance of the free press and right to information, not only as human rights, but also as important prerequisites for democratization in the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara, for putting the issue in both historical and professional perspective. And now we move to Courtney Ratch, Advocacy Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you
Courtney.
so much. Maybe just before I get started, I'll also preface by saying I've been writing about Al Jazeera and the Arab media since 2004, and my doctoral research and book looked at cyber activism and citizen journalism in Egypt. And part of the important role that Al Jazeera has played in the region is giving voice to the voiceless, covering those issues that many of the other news organizations in the region didn't want to cover. But we've seen that throughout its history, Al Jazeera has been a thorn in the side of various governments, from the United States government, which early on, equated it with being a terrorist network of supporting terrorism, through to the current crisis, where you're getting many of similar claims, but from different countries now. First, I want to talk about how hypocritical it is for these countries to be calling for the closure of independent media outlets. And we know that they're calling for they're trying to prevent media outlets, not just Al Jazeera, but also Al Arabiya wa Hajrin, some other, basically many Qatar news sites. Why? Because they're worried about independent coverage. And one of the things that Al Jazeera has done in the region is that it was an alternative to Saudi-backed media in the region, which was dominant for many, many years. I also worked as a journalist at Al Arabiya in Dubai, which is a Saudi-owned satellite news channel. And both my experience there and my research in the region clearly indicates that these satellite news stations that are funded by these governments are clearly extensions of their foreign policy. So we shouldn't be surprised that they tend to reflect the foreign policy priorities of their state backers. That said, they still have a right to broadcast, and they play a very important role. My personal experience at Al Arabiya, we had, pretty good freedom to write about and cover what we wanted, except when it came to things like the Green Revolution in Iran. We had a certain line. We're not allowed to write about Saudi human rights. And I got fired and kicked out of the country over an article I wrote about safety problems on Emirates Airlines. So it's funny to hear these countries talking about needing to put limits on freedom of the press even further beyond their own borders when they already have very severe restrictions. That is not to say that Qatar is a bastion of free press either. In fact, it just recently prevented foreign reporters from reporting on human rights violations in Qatar surrounding the building of the 2022 World Cup facilities. And we've seen that foreign journalists have been harassed. We don't expect that these media outlets, whether it's Al Jazeera in Qatar or Al Arabiya in Dubai or Saudi Arabia, are going to cover those countries well. But they're playing an important role in the region because we need a pluralistic media. As Tamara indicated, the region has been dominated by state-governed media, state-sponsored media for a long time. But we've seen a flourishing of smaller independent outlets. The internet has been very helpful for that, obviously. But we also see that those outlets have become, in the crosshairs of efforts to restrict the free flow of information, to control the narrative, and further their foreign and domestic policy goals. So in Bahrain, for example, they recently shut down Al-Wasat, which is the only independent newspaper in Bahrain. So it's ironic that Bahrain is part of the group's the group of countries calling for the closure of Al Jazeera, and it's simultaneously closing down independent media in its own country. This we find very problematic. Similarly, you have Egypt calling for its closure. Now, Egypt and Al Jazeera and Qatar have had a fraught relationship for years. We saw, during the uprisings that Al Jazeera was targeted. We saw they were targeted by the SCAF, by Morsi, by Sisi. So they've had a difficult relationship. But we've also seen that Egypt, it's not just about Al Jazeera. It's about controlling all of the narrative. That's why Egypt shut down dozens of websites. And it's trying to restrict the control of information as Sisi tries to hold on to power. And it's really sad, having spent a long time in Egypt and worked closely with journalists there, to see how the space for independent and free media in Egypt has constricted so radically. I was there in 2015 talking with the Minister of Transitional Justice and other high-level officials about the fact that they had become the second leading jailer of journalists. This is, unprecedented. It barely even showed up on our list of journalists that imprisoned journalists prior to the 2011 uprisings. This has clearly changed. We've also seen that, Jordan, which is typically seen as a more free, allowing a bit more freedom for its press, has also sought to restrict the freedom of the press in its country. It has put into place registration requirements for online news organizations, and it also revoked Al Jazeera's operating license. So I think what we're seeing broadly throughout the region is that these states are very uncomfortable with the fact that there is a freewheeling media environment, that there is a pluralistic media environment, and that they can't control what is going into the heads of their citizens, or not just citizens, but also guest workers, since many of these countries have more foreigners in their borders than they do citizens. But they want to control the narrative. Obviously, in the Gulf, they have an interest in staving off any sort of movement for reform or democracy. They were largely successful, with the exception of Bahrain, in keeping those reform movements from really having an impact in the Gulf, but I think they remain concerned. And it seems like they saw some of the geopolitical dynamics happening that perhaps they thought would give them permission to take this step, to say, okay, well, we're gonna clamp down on these media, claim that they're promoting terrorism, that they are allied with forces that perhaps the US and others believe are also negative. But I think they miscalculated. The fact is that I think it's recognized around the world that Al Jazeera and other organizations and other news organizations are playing a very important role in bringing stories to the forefront that actually, tell stories that Arabs are interested in hearing, also that people around the world are interested in hearing on the Al Jazeera English network. And there's often this difference that people talk about between the Arabic and the English channel, and that's real, and that's something I think we have to consider, and I think that most of the concern coming in the Gulf is around the Arabic channel. But the fact is, it has covered for years stories that other news organizations weren't covering. That has shifted now. Obviously, we know that the coverage that Al Jazeera used to kind of have a monopoly on, now there are many more independent outlets, but a lot of those are online only because they're not able to gain access to the printing resources. They may have their papers confiscated. They're not granted broadcasting license for radio or television, or the system is rigged in a way that prevents them from setting up outlets other than online. And obviously, we know that a lot of the people in the region are not online and are not necessarily literate. We talked about media literacy, and I think media and information literacy is important, and it's at the root of many of the issues right now that are at the forefront of the kind of global media agenda, including the so-called fake news, issues around countering violent extremism online, all of these sort of things, we should be looking for responses that enable people to make choices about their media consumption and have access to pluralistic views, not seeking to restrict what sort of media they have access to. So I think with that, I will wrap up, and then, of course, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Courtney, very much. And now we move to one of the targets of, although we are all targets, and it's not incidental that we decided to have this briefing at the National Press Building and avail it to people who work here and have it specifically in the First Amendment room. So this is not incidental in terms of how we view this whole campaign. But Abdulrahman Al-Shayal is Chief Executive Officer of Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, one of the outfits that are, of course, or have been targeted by this campaign of closure, if you will.
Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We're here, and I was very happy to be told by Dr. Khalil in the First Amendment room or hall. The First Amendment is a short but very powerful protector of rights that now you've taken for granted. The Arab world, the GCC, the subject of our talk today, has no such First Amendment. The sheer absurdity of governments trying to shut down, or the American government trying to shut down the free press here would shock Americans and millions around the world. It's what makes the country what it is now. The press, for me, and I'm sure for my colleagues who've put forward very strong cases, is as an independent bulwark against the corruption of the powerful, as a light to be shown upon the dark and secretive misdemeanors of those who rule our lives is very important and must be protected. The constant battles between a young cub reporter working a downtown beat or a veteran Pulitzer Prize winning journalist or a TV anchor with politicians, with businessmen, with those in power mean lots of different things to different people. But for those people who come home tired after work, or those who are looking for work or trying to improve their lives, knowing what's happening in their country is crucial. And it's only the media, really, and a free media that can help them know what's going on. Now, we have in many Arab countries, as I'm sure you're aware, ministries of information, something that doesn't exist here. Ministries of culture and information, ministries of communication. Their reach is not simply logistical. They don't look at licensing issues. They don't look at salary scales or workers' rights. They control editorial content and set editorial guidelines. You can therefore imagine in a region where transparency is an incredibly rare commodity that such filtering of information and such censorship damages the development of people in the region and limits the extent to which they can partake in civil society. People across the social spectrum are harmed and are not able to reach information as it should be. Now, what's happened during the Arab Spring was what led to the inception of my organization. Al-Arabi Al-Jadid is a literal, to translate literally, is the new Arab. And it's in the belief that there was an outlet, or there is a need for an outlet such as ours, that provides a platform that is open to everyone, that is pluralistic, that allows people from different sectarian, religious, political persuasions in the region to find a voice against the various regime narratives. Dr. Azmi Bishara, the founder of this, is someone who is a prominent thinker, politician, philosopher, and someone who basically set the standard in a lot of different situations in the region for what many regimes fear, and that's independent way of thought and a belief in freedom and democracy. The blockading nations have banned us, not just us, others, but not just recently. My website and our newspaper has been banned for over a year and a half now. Christmas 2015, to be exact, is when the blocking occurred. We were not given any reasons. We were not told why. Millions of our readers were prevented from using our website in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and in Egypt. We're not affiliated to any group. We don't have any particular preference for any group. In fact, we hold all groups in the region to account. Blocking our site was a simple and clear message from the powers that be that we will not tolerate independent outlets, especially those that people have come to respect and to trust. Now, these actions are indicative of where the GCC is heading. it's only fair and logical to assume that the way in which media has played a huge and destructive part in this current crisis exemplifies the approach these countries are taking to media, to independent media and to press freedom as a whole. Now, obviously, such a background, we can talk for hours and hours on it. Very briefly, before the Arab Spring by a few years possibly, and maybe just after it, there was a brief sojourn into the world of less restrictive censorship in some of the GCC countries. Journalists did test the censor every now and then. Sometimes they got away, but this was mainly to do with social criticisms, looking at traditions and things like this, and you can find them in lots of opinion pieces in newspapers and on TV in the region. But that's not the ideal situation. Press freedom is far different from a journalist every now and then saying that maybe he thinks a woman should drive or that a woman shouldn't cover her hair. Yeah? What's been worse here is that come the counter-revolution, that slight freedom was destroyed. Facts weren't considered when media outlets were being forced or voluntarily went out to carry out vicious character assassinations and smear campaigns against their own people, against democracy activists, against people who want change, against anyone who is remotely democratic or independent in nature. This was essentially, as I would like to describe it, the media forced to destroy itself. State-controlled outlets attacked every non-aligned media outlet. Anchors and commentators attacked the idea of press freedom openly. We don't want press freedom, it's destructive, we don't like it, it's part of a Western, Islamist, Israeli, Zionist, global conspiracy. If we look at the recent campaign, and again, I'll go back to, for example, Dr. Bashara, who is an academic, a good man that I know, I've got to know for a few years, who believes in pluralism and tolerism and sectarianism, and who is a Christian, who has also been accused of being in charge of a global Islamist terrorist plot. Over 20 daily newspapers, over 50 websites in the region, and over 5 pan-Arab international broadcasters would latch on to him. And I'm using him here purely as a prominent example. There are many, many others too. And spew absolutely unsubstantiated filth. The idea isn't just to discredit him, it's to intimidate the 200-odd journalists who work in my organization. It's also to create fear amongst the millions who believe in this vision for a new Arab region and world that is free and independent. Just on the side, there was during this crisis erupted at the beginning of Ramadan. There's a very famous soap or TV series that airs every Ramadan. They even, in the last minute, created an episode specifically about him, using very xenophobic, racist, and sectarian messages within this series, where he was described in very negative terms. The other thing about the press being used to attack itself is that newspaper editors-in-chief in the region have been calling for the closure of outlets. This beggars belief. Journalists, writers, editors-in-chief, people who run media outlets themselves as journalists, not simply as managers, have been calling for the closure of their peers. This is madness, and it's intolerable. Journalists from these countries who work for Qatar-linked outlets have also been forced to resign and to give statements saying that they are with what's going on. Prison sentences, as Dr. Jahshan has mentioned, of up to 15 years, not just for normal people, for journalists, for people who are covering things. And sympathy with is simply just another term of describing anything that disagrees with us. And what this has done is not just push journalists in the region into self-censorship mode, but it's also meant that out of fear, they will begin writing articles in support of what's going on to try and make sure they don't get affected. This isn't just the full picture. I mean, there are things that possibly some of you might not know. One of the people leading the campaign in one of these countries is an intelligence officer who is a journalist who runs an operations room using hundreds and hundreds of people working out of fake Facebook and Twitter accounts, creating smear campaigns, character assassinations, intimidating journalists. I have seen messages from him on WhatsApp, on messages and on Twitter to colleagues of mine in this particular country, telling them say this and say that, and you know, the ruler I'm being a bit cagey here because I don't want to get them in trouble, are doing this. Huge TV outlets have done the same. Sky News Arabia has done far more damage to the credibility of its owner and to the franchise than possibly the phone hacking scandal in the UK has done. Sky News Arabia has carried out a 24/7 campaign against news outlets, giving absolutely unsubstantiated facts about their involvement in terrorism and terrorist activities. Saudi-owned NBC as well followed suit, along with a number of other pan-Arab outlets. What is the actual argument here? Is it that independent media outlets support terrorism, that media outlets and their willingness to stand on the side of the oppressed are tools to create and foment anarchy in the GCC and the broader Arab world? I don't think so. Remember that the campaign against outlets like the New Arab and Al Jazeera and others, the outlets that carry out these campaigns now refer to the Arab Spring as the so-called Arab Spring. This gives a clear indication of what they think. They refer to this broad and very widespread sweeping feeling of hope in the region as a tool to overthrow benevolent governments and regimes. This is how they portray the Arab Spring. So for me, this is not a good thing. Obviously, this is a smokescreen, I think, for many things, this whole campaign, but one of them is that they cannot really come out and say that freedom of expression is a really bad thing and we're going to fight it, even though, as a UAE ambassador to Moscow slipped up in an interview a few weeks ago, he said, well, we're not actually really out to promote press freedom, we're against it. Yeah, so it's not so much a Freudian slip as it is a very brutal moment of frankness. Press freedom as well should not be and is not confined to any one particular group. Otherwise, it hasn't become a universal ideal or value. It's the fear of truth, of the public's yearning for it, of the people's desire for truth that has made these regimes try to destroy it. To do it, they demonize certain groups. They would retract from them their right of freedom of expression and a free press. And then anyone who doesn't buy into this narrative is therefore guilty by association. Now, let's also move on very quickly to social media, because once we've realized that these state outlets have carried out what they've carried out, please also let's note that private media outlets are not that private in the Arab world. They still fall under a great degree of censorship and government interference. Imagine Amanpour being a member of the FBI, or even Hannity being a member of the military. This is what is the situation in many outlets in the Arab world. Many anchors, many editors-in-chief, many journalists are officers in state intelligence. This is not an exaggeration. This is a fact, and I'm more than happy, to point you in the direction of where this exists. The blockading countries have also infiltrated social media circles. Okay, there are teams and teams and millions of dollars really poured into creating false campaigns online, destroying organically grown trends and hashtags, using them to post pornographic images or adverts of cheap apartments or perfume for sale. This kind of thing is bizarre. You can see it on Twitter whenever there's outrage, public outrage over a certain event in one of these countries. You'll click on the hashtag and then you'll find someone selling you a flat in Istanbul or some cheap perfume knockoff, in a car boot sale or something. And these have become very sophisticated and very, very well run, control rooms, okay? They employ a lot of people and they really play a part in destroying any kind of independent discussion even on social media. And social media remains, for many people, probably the only tool that they see as almost independent because of the fact that it's very difficult to control 20 million Twitter users or 50 million Facebook users. Ironically as well, these operation rooms also spread sectarianism to whip up hate between communities in the region. Is it therefore reasonable to infer that within the political and economic motivations behind the blockade lie motivations to censor, block and control media within the GCC? Yes, I think so. After all, the polarization within the state and non-state media has created, there is no space for any kind of differing opinion. In fact, I think it's a far worse time to be a Saudi or an Emirati journalist now than it is to be a Qatari one. You have no room to move. You have to take a certain narrative. And this really should be of concern to everyone here, given the significance of these countries. If such moves are made permanent and the complete regime media narrative covers everything else, then it's more than likely that this will spread across the entire region, emboldening those who would have otherwise lived with a freer media. Let me say here, the Arab people are not stupid. Increasingly, they've turned to independent outlets for sources of news. More and more people are fact-checking. More and more people are looking for various sources to try and understand just what on earth is going on in their countries. That's why regimes have placed such harsh sentences on those who carry out or post things against who dare to go beyond state narratives. That's why they're demanding to shut down media outlets. That's why state-sanctioned smear campaigns are the order of the day. The lack of free media can be one of the causal factors of extremism or terrorism, as well as a key obstacle to human development. I say this knowing the region very well and having worked in the media. We shouldn't accept this blatant encroachment of the state. We cannot, not just for the sake of those who will suffer as a result of it, those who work in the media directly, but because of the need for people there, fellow human beings, for a free press. I think, just to close up here, we've reached a point in the GCC which has really outdone any Orwellian future we could never wish to live in. To allow this to pass means that we will inadvertently be contributing to the rapid decline of rights in the region and the rise of greater public discontent and disillusionment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking all three panelists for their presentation. If you have a question or a remark you would like us to respond to, please raise your card at this time, and staff will pick it up. And while we're waiting, Abdu just used the word Orwellian, and definitely we have been witnessing quite a few Orwellian behaviors the past few weeks, and I'm reminded of a recent quote by my good friend Sarah Leah Whitson, Middle East Director at Human Rights Watch, when she said recently that Gulf states are reaching a new level of Orwellian reality when they throw citizens in jail for both criticizing other Gulf nations and voicing public support for them. I wish they would choose, but that's the nature of the beast at this time.
One thing that has also been interesting is to see how prior to 2011 and the uprisings, several countries were kind of behind, several countries in the region were behind the game in terms of regulating online speech. But we've definitely seen in the past few years that speech regulation online and the punishments and sanctions that are put in place for abrogating speech restrictions online have in some cases exceeded those offline. So you're actually seeing, as you said, both, prison sentences for supporting as well as criticizing the same thing.
All right, thank you. Let me start basically with Samer Al-Shahabi from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Basically refers to the different media control attempts by different countries in the region, including jailing of journalists and so on by countries, for example, that he mentions like Turkey, who does support Qatar in the Gulf crisis and so on. Is there a discussion about setting up a regional, transnational body that could protect press freedom in the region? Entire panel.
I don't know that this is something that a body could do. I mean, there are many organizations that actively promote press freedom, that advocate on behalf of journalists who are imprisoned, and who advocate with the governments, both organizations like my own, as well as Reporters Without Borders, as well as regional groups like the Gulf Center for Human Rights, the Cairo Institute. Many groups are trying to do that. I think the problem is that you have a combination of laws that criminalize forms of speech, that criminalize press freedom, or abrogating the red lines, and you don't have the regional bodies that you have in other regions that are willing to regulate themselves. The GCC is not interested, I don't think, in holding each other to higher standards. They're all they all heavily censor independent media and even state media. But also, you don't necessarily see high levels of imprisonment in, all throughout the Gulf or all throughout the region, because there are such strict lines that there's so much self-censorship that it can actually, you don't get to the point where you need to imprison, right? You imprison journalists when they push the red lines. I think the fact that Turkey is the leading jailer of journalists and is ostensibly a democracy is deeply concerning and should be for everyone. But I'm not sure, what role they would see for the region to play in Turkey. There's no normative authority there.
We have Ja'far Ja'fari from Al-Mayadeen asking, Abdu, that's for you. Arab Satellite is a conduit for media dissemination, has censored many organizations for political reasons in the past. Now that Qatar is being targeted, is an alternative needed or imminent?
Alternative
to the Arabsat?
Quite possibly. For those of you who don't know, Arabsat is controlled, I think, by the Arab League. So, if I'm not mistaken, and so essentially what happens is that regimes are able to switch channels off and on by the touch of a button. Yeah, I guess, the thing is we do need to have freedom of access to information. Now, the whole premise of this crisis is the fact that regimes don't want to give up control. They do not want independent media, and they do not want their people to reach independent sources. If regimes control the very satellites that beam channels into your bedroom, into your living room, and are able to switch them off at whim, and they have done so in the past 10 years, then this is disastrous. How we can create an alternative to this, I'm not sure. I'm guessing it must be almost impossible to crowdfund a satellite to go in space and broadcast from it. I'm not sure what the alternatives are, but certainly the audiences have been relying on, as I said, social media, for example, as an alternative. Quite possibly another bright spark in Silicon Valley or somewhere in the region might come up with an alternative platform as well, which will be beyond the reach of the censor. But this is a very good point, and it is very scary. It's very scary indeed. Imagine the government here being able to switch off a channel. This is the parallel that Arab people are facing, that even access to information in their own homes is at risk.
Well, and the other option is Nilesat, which is owned by Egypt, so I don't see that as being an alternative either. But I think, if I may, just that this issue, hardware matters. Even as we talk about the importance of social media and the internet as an alternative, let's remember that we're seeing a huge expansion of network shutdowns around the world and of, restrictions on the internet, of selective filtering and censoring. And we have to remember that there's hardware behind all of, our ability to access the internet and social media. And in general, the satellites, the the lines into the country that carry the internet, the major, most of these countries have one or two in the region. So it's very easy for them to manipulate. And many of the ISPs, the internet service providers, are either state-owned or state-affiliated, or obviously given a license with the, by the grace of the state. So, there are many points where we have to look for that pressure from the states.
To add just briefly, we see development in technology that open opportunities for alternative ways, but governments will always find a way to counter that as long as they have the power. And I think that's the real issues. Alternatives will be there. We'll see new alternatives that we don't have today, but there will be also ways to counter those. But just as a small side note, there are alternatives taking place now in the Arab world. We see television programs, news programs that are exclusively online, especially among young people that watch these videos. And they have not been a serious threat to governments yet, so they have not attempted to counter those. But there are plenty of alternatives and also plenty of countermeasures by governments.
Greg Aftandelian directs this question to Courtney. Many GCC countries have laws on the books against quote-unquote defaming the country or quote-unquote insulting the ruler or the government. How important is it to change these laws, or will these governments repress anyway the media, regardless of such laws?
Yes and yes. So I think it is important to reform those laws because the laws do criminalize defamation, they criminalize insult, so they're criminalizing forms of speech. Obviously, what constitutes defamation or insult is going to be up to that ruler or that state to determine. So it is something that is being used throughout the region, not just against journalists, but against average citizens. And so that's deeply problematic because, as I mentioned before, you're seeing even more restrictive laws online, harsher punishments online. One of the challenges is that many people don't actually know what the laws are, and many of these countries are not forthcoming with making clear what are the actual laws that are in place. So when there's a law in place and you don't even know what it is, that's very dangerous as well. Getting rid of those laws would be important, but I would tend to think that you're probably still going to see ways that they will seek to repress and restrict information and free expression. Again, because they're seeking to maintain control in an environment where you have a lot more information, where you have a lot more learning, globalization, people seeing other alternatives. And I think part of their calculus is that information control is essential to regime stability and to regime existence. So I think you would have to work on both prongs, frankly.
There are laws preventing defamation of the rulers, but there are no laws preventing the rulers' media defaming citizens. Yeah?
True.
My colleague, Dr. Kassab, just brought to my attention that basically Qatar, in terms of alternatives, has recently established a satellite called Suhail, and that it already started operations. It's functional. I have two questions pertaining to the relationship between media outlets in the Gulf and the governments being affiliated or controlled by the governments as surrogates. One of them has a name, so I'll read this one. The other one doesn't have a name, so I won't read it, but they are basically similar questions. Let's say, you mentioned, Courtney, that Qatar, in the Arab world, that the media quite often are surrogates of their sponsoring governments, and they follow that country's political agenda in many ways. Can't this also be made, this case can be made against Western media as well? This is Warren David.
Anyone's free to make any argument they want, but I think that one of the things that we look at when we're looking at how closely a specific media adheres to a particular state's agenda is the funding structures and the governance structures. So, in the Gulf, you see that let's take Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera, are funded by the Saudi or the Qatari government or those who are close to the government. You see that the governance structure and the way that decision making is made in terms of who is leading in different departments, how those decisions are made, who gets put in positions of power, has to do with political calculus. So you can take that framework for analysis and look at any media organization. We often look at the BBC, which is, you hear the argument a lot, oh, well, they're state-sponsored, or Voice of America, well, it's state-sponsored. But there are specific governance structures and funding structures that are put in place in order to enable a distance so that that political influence does not infiltrate into the editorial line. So feel free to make the case, but I think that it will be less strong and than in many other cases.
Yeah.
All right. The last question I have from Rosemary is addressed to Abdu. If you were participating or attending the Press Freedom Voice of America on critical issues, what would be your message regarding this GCC crisis and the media?
Journalists need to support each other. If they're fortunate enough to be living in in Washington or in America or in other countries that do not impose restrictions or censorship on them, then they should use that freedom to talk on behalf of and in support of journalists in other parts of the world who do not have that freedom and who do not have that right, which is being presented to them as some kind of privilege. The danger is, because, particularly in the Arab world, because if we go back to the first question about bodies supporting journalists and so on, because press freedom isn't there, many journalists are forced to take up the role of advocate and activist as well, because at the end of the day, they are making a political statement in going beyond the reach of the censor. So this kind of like gives them far more work than they already have, and it makes their life far more difficult and more dangerous. In order to try and support them in that, journalists, whether they're at the Voice of America event or anywhere else, really they should make this clear to people, and they should stand in support of this. And they should also report critically those outlets that are actually complicit in the torture, in the intimidation, and in the censorship of fellow journalists in the region.
All right, Abdu, could you please just conclude with the launching on
okay.
the...
Yes.
What is being launched? What is this Al-Arabi Jadid network?
So we have our organization has a newspaper, a few websites, and a TV outlet. It's being relaunched on Monday, in fact, on a number of various Arab satellite stations. It's already been pulled off one cable provider in the region so far. Please watch it. It's a 24/7 operation: news, current affairs, political programs, entertainment, family shows, that kind of thing. We're hoping it will be a leader in the region very soon. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And a special thank you to all three panelists for their willingness to participate today. And thank you to all of you for being here.